Hey guys, and welcome to this quick, rapid reaction to the Dobbs v. Jackson oral arguments. Those happened today. The Mississippi 15-week ban was before the Supreme Court, and the attorneys for each side were arguing, and we're going to give rapid reaction of both the arguments that were made, but also the justices, how they reacted, with a specific focus on the 5 justices who we don't know what they'll do, because 4 of them we know what they'll do, but we're going to focus specifically on the 5 justices who are swing votes in this case.
Yeah, and before we get into too much of the details on that, we just want to let people get on. But also, it's just important to note, a lot of people are very excited. There's a lot of news, a lot of buzz going on right now. The important point with all of this is, regardless what the Supreme Court does, they should be defied before they even have a time to make the decision. Yeah. We don't need to wait on them. It needs to be abolished immediately without exception or compromise. We do not need anybody's permission to do it. The Constitution is clear on that. 14th Amendment is clear on that. We have the right and the duty to uphold justice and abolish abortion immediately without exception or compromise, and no court can tell us otherwise. So just as an aside and as a preface to all of this, we need to be clear that this is not necessary. Regardless of what the court does today, it is not necessary that they change their mind. It never has been, and it never will be.
Yeah, and that's really important, and that's kind of the difference between the abolitionist perspective and the pro-life perspective on this, is that the pro-lifers, if the Supreme Court strikes this down or even allows it but still keeps Roe and Casey, the pro-lifers are going to submit completely. Abolitionists are saying, no, even the court could decide this anytime, really, between January and June of next year, probably closer to June, and so we're saying, in February, March, all these states need to be defying the Supreme Court before the decision in this case even comes down. Mm-hmm. That's, the duty is not to the Supreme Court. The duty of state-level magistrates is first and foremost to God, from whom all authority is derived, and then secondarily to the Constitution, which protects the right to life, protects the right to equal protection. And so that's the abolitionist perspective, that the court is not needed in this case. Mm-hmm. But there is a case, and so we're going to do this video to give just a brief overview, first of all, of the case. So we're going to talk about what it's about, and then, the arguments of the attorneys and the responses of the justices. So as an overview of the case, so Mississippi a few years ago passed a ban on abortion after 15 weeks. Now, the reason this is a controversy, it's going to the Supreme Court, is because technically that violates the standard set forth in the Casey v. Planned Parenthood decision in 1992, which said that no ban on abortion prior to viability can be allowed. So basically anything prior to 20 weeks is going to be stricken down by every court across America. But the Mississippi attorneys appealed this up to the Supreme Court, and so now the 15-week ban is before the Supreme Court, and that's what they're arguing about. So the arguments made by the Mississippi attorneys who are arguing the pro-life side, and then the pro-abortion attorneys, it went pretty much what we were expecting. So the Mississippi Solicitor General went up and argued basically Roe v. Wade was egregiously wrong, and it should be overturned. It has no basis in the text of the Constitution. It has no basis just in the history of American law prior to Roe v. Wade. It was a complete fabrication of the court, and it should be overturned in full. Now, that's kind of the better part. He also hedged his bets a little bit. He talked both in his statement and in his responses to the judges about a possible compromise, which we'll get to later, which is actually it's the worst case scenario. I would say even worse than striking it down and upholding Roe and Casey in full would be this compromise solution. We'll get to why that's the worst case. But he kind of hedged his bets, and he said, even if you don't overturn Roe and Casey in full, there still is the compromise solution where the 15-week ban could be upheld, but Roe and Casey will basically remain standing, except the line will come down from 20 weeks to 15 weeks.
And that is really the result of the law that they're arguing right now. That is the more natural thing that someone would argue. Yeah. Because they're putting forward a compromise to the court. And so you really have to argue in some capacity compromise. You can say, hey, let's overturn Roe v. Wade, let's get rid of it, it's immoral, it's terrible, it's all this stuff. But the law that you're using to bring it there is a compromised law. You're not doing it on the basis of a law that says let's abolish abortion entirely.
Right. And that's a really good point, and then that fits in right in with the arguments. The arguments, he did argue a little bit about the importance of human life, but the emphasis was not on, the primary emphasis was not that this is murder and that this has to be abolished. And that would be the most powerful argument that could be made. Mm-hmm. But he can't really make that because that's not the case that he's arguing. And so, that definitely reflected in the arguments that he was making. And so that's mostly what he did. And it was actually good. I was actually a little bit surprised when the Mississippi amicus brief came out, and they actually were focusing on overturning Roe entirely, because the strategy for the most part of the pro-life attorneys and politicians has been, well, just allow this moderate compromise. You don't have to overturn Roe. So they are being a little bit more aggressive, asking for Roe to be overturned in full. But it's still, obviously, it's short of what we would call for, which is overturn Roe in full. And if you don't, and even before you do, we're going to defy you and abolish abortion because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, which is a particularly insane line of attack when it comes to actually taking things to the Supreme Court, because the whole idea behind these incremental laws, at least from the pro-life perspective, is to trigger a review from the Supreme Court. And so if you're getting before the Supreme Court, it is completely insane to not just argue, let's abolish abortion now, let's not allow for this to happen anymore. But instead, oftentimes what happens is states get to that point and they'll argue as though they want the increment, which is not what they want. That was just supposed to trigger the review,
right?
Which is crazy. So, yeah.
So that's kind of the pro-life argument that was made. The pro-abortion attorneys, they argued along the lines of what you would expect. So they argued first and foremost from liberty, freedom, autonomy. Of course, liberty, freedom, autonomy, choice to murder a human being is kind of the end of that sentence that they never complete. But yeah, they were arguing for all that stuff on grounds of autonomy and freedom. And they also argued on the grounds of because the Supreme Court has held this in the past, they should continue to uphold this. And this is a principle called stare decisis. And so they're arguing that, well, this is what you said in 92, this is what you said back in 1973, and so it's what you should continue to say today. And that was one of their main arguments. What was interesting is that was the main argument pursued by the pro-abortion justices as well. And so, yeah, that was their argument. And so with that, let's move on to the justices. So there are 9. Of those 9, there's one who we know wants to overturn Roe completely. Wants to get rid of the whole thing, doesn't want to compromise, wants to get rid of it, and that is Justice Clarence Thomas. And he has written opinions and both in affirmation of the majority decision and dissents from the majority decision in the past, calling for Roe to be completely overturned. So we know where he stands, but none of the other Republican-appointed justices have ever joined him in that stance. And so we don't actually know that any of them will join him in wanting to completely overturn Roe and voting to completely overturn Roe. And so he's the only one that we know. I don't want to focus too much on the justice who we know, but I do want to touch on one interesting thing that Clarence Thomas did say, an interesting line of argument he made against the pro-abortion attorneys. And that was just this idea that if a woman is pregnant and she takes drugs that harm that child, is that child is that a crime that's being committed against the child, even pre-viability? And the pro-abortion attorney was saying, well, the state can do that after viability, but he's saying no, pre-viability. Answer this question: before viability, should it be a crime for a mother to take drugs that permanently harm that unborn child? Basically trying to make the point that, of course, it's a person, of course, it's a human being, and you know that, and we all know that, because they can be harmed by the mother taking drugs. So he did have some good lines of questions, kind of attacking the pro-abortion attorneys and their position. And then on the other side of the justice who we know, there's the 3 liberal justices who we know will vote to uphold Roe and Casey. Justices Sotomayor, Justice Breyer, and Justice Kagan. And they focus, as I mentioned, mostly on the stare decisis argument, that because this is what we've held, this is what we should always hold. And in especially good encapsulation of that position was when Justice Sotomayor argued against the Mississippi Solicitor General, who was arguing the pro-life position. She basically said, I believe word for word, how will this institution, how will the court survive if we overturn Roe? Because if we overturn Roe, then we look like we're acting politically, and our opinions change just based on the justices changing. And so if we change our position, we're going to look political, and the court as an institution will not survive. Now, of course, the obvious irony is that because of the court, more than 60 million children have not survived. They've been brutally murdered because of Justice Sotomayor and the many others since 1973 who have held her position. Right, so there's an obvious irony there
because of the political nature of their decision too.
Exactly.
All of the liberal justices on the court are liberal justices. Their whole purpose on being on the court is they believe it's a living document that they can interpret in light of whatever liberal idea they have. Yeah. And there's no sort of pretense of not being political when they go about interpreting the Constitution. They only use that as a cudgel against people who would say, no, let's go back to the Constitution.
Right.
So it's not even a real argument that they subscribe to. They actually believe in being political.
Yeah, and that's the Mississippi Solicitor General had a good response to her, and he said, no, like, you lost the authority. Well, he didn't say it in these words, but I'm gonna change his words a bit to make it a bit stronger and more accurate. No, you lost your authority when you legalized murder. Like, when you sanctioned genocide, that's what causes you to lose your real authority. That's what causes you to lose respect in the eyes of anyone who has their head on straight, is when you say murder is legal. And so that was a political decision, and as the Mississippi attorney pointed out, it has no that ruling, Roe and Casey, had no basis in the text of the Constitution. There is no right to abortion in the Constitution. There's nothing resembling a right to abortion in the Constitution. It was a complete and total fabrication of the 1973 and 1992 Supreme Courts. There's nothing resembling abortion in the Constitution. And so, yeah, it was political. It was a political decision of the court, which is not supposed to be a political branch, to say, yes, abortion is a right of people. People have the right to murder their children. And so that's what actually should cause the loss of respect. And again, this was the primary argument that those justices, the liberal bloc, was using against the attorney's arguments for Mississippi. So with that, that's kind of where the two sides we know stand. Let's get to the five justices who are going to decide this case. What happens is going to be decided by these five justices. It's going to start with Chief Justice John Roberts, and as the Chief Justice and as the most moderate justice, his opinion is going to count a lot. And if there is a compromise scheme that they come up with, it's going to come from his mind most likely. And so Justice Roberts, Justice Samuel Alito, Justice Coney Barrett, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and Justice Neil Gorsuch. And so let's start with Justice John Roberts. Now, as expected, he talked about this compromise option. And so the pro-abortion attorney was arguing to him, kind of against a complete overturn of Roe, and Roberts kept bringing the conversation back to, no, I'm just talking about the 15-week ban. And then he asked, how is the 15-week ban any significant difference from the 20-week ban? Because you're saying that banning abortion is going to cause all these awful effects on women and take away women's liberty and women's autonomy and all this stuff. But the difference between a 20-week ban and a 15-week ban is not all that big. It's a very moderate, small change. And so that was his line of questioning, and so that was expected. So he's looking at this compromise scheme, which, as we'll get to at the end, it really is the worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully the other justices don't follow him in pursuing that scheme.
Yeah, and even asking these kinds of questions it's totally not it's not about what the Constitution says. Right. It's about, well, how can we walk this back a little bit so that it's sort of appeasing both sides. That's not looking at the text of the Constitution and saying, what does this say? What are we required to do as an institution that is supposed to interpret the Constitution and federal law? But instead, they're going and making, making an argument about very political things, like how do we appease both sides instead of how do we actually interpret the Constitution as it's supposed to be interpreted?
Yeah, and that's how Roberts operates. It's very unfortunate when you have a guy like Roberts who he's a politician. So John Roberts is not going to look at a case and say, what does the Constitution say? What John Roberts does is he lifts his finger and puts it up in the air and he says, where are the cultural and political winds blowing? And wherever they're blowing, I want to find myself right in the middle, because I want to appear as the moderate, I want to appear as the centrist who's impartial to either side. And so it doesn't really matter what the correct answer is as much to Roberts. He's just always trying to appear as the moderate, as the centrist, as the reasonable person finding the reasonable compromise. And so, again, it's no surprise that his lines of questioning were what they were, because that's the way that he is. He's not someone who cares as much about the truth and the Constitution as he is someone who cares about being the moderate on the court. And so that's very unfortunate, and it's not how it's supposed to work, and it's causing a lot of damage. That mindset has just absolutely destroyed the integrity of the Supreme Court. And so very unfortunate. And so hopefully the other justices don't follow his lead in that. So next justice, Alito. Now Alito, like Clarence Thomas, he pursued some good lines of questioning, kind of poking holes in the reasoning of the pro-abortion attorneys. The first thing he pointed out was just the arbitrariness of that 20-week line that was set by KCB Planned Parenthood of viability. So he's saying, your pro-abortion attorneys, you're arguing that women have autonomy and freedom and liberty and choice and all this stuff. That doesn't go away at 20 weeks. If you're going to argue on the basis of freedom and liberty and autonomy and choice and all this stuff, then you need to argue for abortion up to the moment of conception, because this line that we drew in Casey is completely arbitrary. And there's no reason that line should be at 20 weeks. It was just a line that was drawn by the chief or the justice at the time who authored the Roe decision. And that justice, Harry Blackmun, admitted this 20-week line is completely arbitrary. But we have to choose a point, and so we'll just, hey, here's 20 weeks. Completely arbitrary, but just what the court thought up to kind of make the compromise work. But the court shouldn't be making arbitrary lines. And as I talked about, they need to make principled decisions based in reason. And so the pro-abortion attorney didn't much like this line of questioning. She said, no, it is a principled decision, because that's when the child can survive outside the womb, is at viability around 20 weeks. And then Alito was like, no, you're just explaining what viability is. You're not explaining why that's not an arbitrary standard for when life should be protected by law. It's completely arbitrary, and she had no legitimate response to that. And so I think it was good that he pointed out the arbitrariness there. The other thing that he did, what was the other thing? Oh yes, the arbitrariness of stare decisis, or the weakness of the stare decisis argument. And so everyone admits that Plessy v. Ferguson was wrong, right? This whole separate but equal doctrine, and these states can have schools for black kids that are supposedly equal, but they're really not. It's different from the white kids, and we're going to legally separate the two. And pretty much everyone admits that wasn't right for them to do that. And so the pro-abortion attorneys were arguing stare decisis. You can't go back on Roe. You can't change Roe. The only way to change Roe is if new information has come forward. Unless new information has come in that changes the facts of the case, you can't change what you've already said. And so what Alito responded to that with is he said, well, Plessy v. Ferguson, they decided that this discrimination was legal, back in the late 1800s. Say that the year after that decision, a very similar or the same case basically came before them. Should they have overruled Plessy v. Ferguson? And of course, she doesn't want to say yes, because then she has to admit that Roe can be overturned. But she also can't really say no, because she knows the answer is yes. And so he kind of pointed out that, of course, if something's wrong, even if there's no new information, even if it's the very next year, we should overturn it. Mm-hmm. And so this idea that you can't overturn things is really, really silly. And again, it denigrates truth. We're saying the facts don't matter, the Constitution doesn't matter. All that matters is what the court has ruled previously. Yeah, and Roe v. Wade was an overturning of an old order, of an old idea that you cannot have legalized abortion. So even the Roe decision itself was against stare decisis. It was against the idea that we cannot change our mind. And obviously was not in line with the way that previous justices had interpreted the Constitution. Because otherwise they would have done it far sooner. They would have done it at the beginning. So they don't care about stare decisis at all. The pro-abortion, it's just a means to an end. It's not a actual argument that they fully believe. They just want whatever they want, and any principle, whether it's stare decisis, the Constitution, be damned. They don't care about it. Yeah, if it came to a different case where they wanted it to be overturned, they're not going to be preaching stare decisis. It's a useful point whenever you like a certain precedent, as he pointed out. Mm-hmm. So moving on to the next justice, Justice Amy Coney Barrett. She kept things pretty close to the vest. She didn't really signify one way or the other on if she would prefer the compromise option or keeping Roe. I think it's not likely that she votes to completely uphold Roe. I think with Coney Barrett, it's kind of between the compromise option or the overturning Roe option. She didn't signify. She pursued one line of questioning. The pro-abortion attorneys were saying things along the lines of how huge of a burden children are, and how we shouldn't harm poor mothers, who don't have the money to take care of their children and all this stuff. And Amy Coney Barrett pointed out, well, there is adoption, and there's safe haven laws all over the country, and so you're talking about this awful burden, which there's a very principled argument against the disgustingness of just talking about how big of a burden children are, instead of how big of a blessing that children and family are. But Amy Coney Barrett was pointing out to the pro-abortion attorneys, look, you're saying there's this huge burden. There's adoption. There's all these other things. Giving birth doesn't have to be this massive financial burden. There are ways around that. And so, but other than that, she didn't pursue many lines of questioning that would lead one way or the other. And neither really did Samuel Alito. He pointed out the problems with pro-abortion arguments. but he didn't signal whether he would kind of go for more of the compromise or go for more of the complete overturn. So that goes for both Amy Coney Barrett and for Samuel Alito. So moving on to Brett Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh was interesting, and he's an interesting case because during his confirmation process, which was very, very heated, if you're tuning into kind of the political scene at that time, because he was justice being appointed by Trump to replace kind of a progressive hero of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and so it was a very heated. The left absolutely lost their mind, even on someone like Kavanaugh, who's not really even that good of a justice. He's a very moderate justice in a lot of ways, not a very consistently Christian or conservative giver of opinions. But in any case, that was a very heated confirmation, and in that confirmation, he told Justice, he told the senators who were voting on his confirmation that 5 votes is not enough to overturn Roe. That you've got to have 6 or 7. You've got to show more of a consensus. You can't just do it with 5 people. And so what that means for this case is that unless you have Justice Roberts, unless you have all of the Republican-appointed justices, including Roberts, if what Kavanaugh said during his confirmation is true, he's not going to vote to completely overturn Roe. Now that's interesting because his
even more than Roberts, if he's saying 7, you need one of the pro-abortion judges at that point too.
Well, he was just saying you need more than 5. So I think the idea would be you could do it with 6 as a minimum. His lines of questioning were mostly along the lines to point out that overturning Roe would not abolish abortion. Now, we would make the argument, and in the amicus brief that the Foundation to Abolish Abortion put together that we were very happy to contribute to and sign on to, in that brief, Attorney Bradley Pierce, an abolitionist attorney, talked about the need and the right thing to do in this case would be the Supreme Court to abolish abortion completely because the right to life is constitutional. The right to equal protection is constitutional. And so because of that's what the Supreme Court should do. But as I mentioned, no current Supreme Court justices are going to go for that, I don't believe. And so Kavanaugh was making clear, look, we're not deciding on whether or not to abolish abortion. We're just deciding on whether or not to put this back to the states. And there was no hint from Kavanaugh about kind of the compromise option, or he didn't seem, or wasn't showing any public interest in that compromise option, but he was talking about kind of, just the concept of putting it back to the states.
And the crazy thing about that is what the pro-life movement has been asking for consistently for a long time. I'm not talking about the attorneys who take a law to the Supreme Court. I'm talking about the actual activists in the pro-life movement. Yeah. They asked for Roe to be overturned so that it goes back to the states, so that states have a right to choose. And that's not what the court should do. The court should abolish abortion. They should interpret the Constitution correctly, say that the 14th Amendment applies to all people regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of race, and then say it is consistent with the Constitution to not allow abortion in any cases. That's the opinion that the Supreme Court ought to put forward. But that is not the one that the pro-life movement has ever consistently asked them to do. They've only asked them to overturn it.
The vast majority of the pro-life movement, that is what they're asking for. And they actually believe most pro-life attorneys, including the Mississippi Solicitor General, was saying the Constitution is neutral on abortion, which I think is preposterous. That's only true if we don't actually know that life begins at conception, right?
Or if you agree with the interpretation of the 14th Amendment that they're not really persons. Yeah. If you actually dehumanize them to the point of not agreeing that they're persons, you can then say that the Constitution is neutral.
Right.
That's the only way, though.
But if you're going to treat them as equal, then you've got to abolish abortion based on what the Constitution says, because it protects the right to life and the right to equal protection. And we will link to the amicus brief that was written by abolitionist attorney Bradley Pierce, either in the description or in the comments of this video, so you can go and read his arguments along these lines. He spent about 2/3 of it arguing basically the court needs to overturn Roe because it's wrong, and if you don't, we're going to ignore it and abolish abortion anyway. He spent most of the time there, but he also argued this 14th Amendment argument that the Supreme Court should abolish abortion. But Kavanaugh and the vast majority of pro-lifers are saying, no, the Constitution is neutral, and so the reasonable thing to do is to simply put it back to the states and allow each state to decide how it's going to regulate or prohibit abortion. And so that's kind of where he was hinting. That's where it looks like where he's leaning. But Kavanaugh, again, kind of like Roberts, he's one of those guys who kind of, he kind of tries to figure out the politically savvy thing to do in any particular case. And so, if Roberts is real strong on pushing that compromise option, even though Kavanaugh didn't seem very interested in it in oral arguments, I could see Kavanaugh kind of going with what Roberts wants to do on that. And so, yeah, that looked like, to be where he is. The final justice is Gorsuch, who said very little. He asked very few questions. I think the only question he asked was a clarifying question, and it was about Roberts' compromise option. So Roberts asked the pro-abortion attorney about the compromise, and then Gorsuch asked a clarifying question on what the pro-abortion attorney's position was on that compromise. And so that could signal that he's interested in kind of that compromise road, or it could signal that he was just trying to kind of expose her view on it, so that Roberts would not go for that. It's hard to say kind of what he thought there because he didn't say very much. But Gorsuch is a wild card, so he'll author some really good conservative opinions on economics or on various issues. But then on some social issues, like on the transgender rights case, totally went full-blown leftist, basically like legislated from the bench, made the Equality Act law, which is an incredibly radical, basically pro-transgender rights and imposition on religious liberty. That was a bill that was before Congress, and he just made it law from the court, along with Roberts and the liberal justices. And so he'll kind of be all over the place on different issues. And so he's a real wild card in this. We'll have to see where he comes down because he kept it very close to the vest. And as I said, he's never said publicly, like all of the justices except for Thomas, has never said publicly which way he's going to go on this. And so like most of the Republican appointed justices, Gorsuch is a wild card, and we'll just have to see, whether he goes with the compromise option or the full overturn option. So I think the takeaway here, I think, is that the compromise option probably is the most likely, because I don't think that Kavanaugh has the stomach to completely overturn Roe. He's been very cautious since being confirmed. Same with Amy Coney Barrett and Gorsuch. They've both been kind of very, very cautious to anger the left too much in their decisions. And so I know Thomas will go for complete overturn. I think Alito might, but I don't think there's any other kind of real strong support on the court for that. They might surprise us. I think the growth of the abolitionist movement is what might cause them to actually overturn Roe. I think that's a very important point. So as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And so until there's a real movement saying, no, you're wrong, and we're going to do the right thing, and we're demanding you do the right thing, and even if you don't, we're going to do the right thing. Until you have that strong call for abolition, you're probably not going to see any real change, and we haven't seen any real change for 49 years. But with the abolitionist movement growing, abolitionist legislators growing in number, abolitionist organizations growing in number, new bills popping up all over the place every single year, with that growth, you may see kind of the court wanting to get out in front of it and not be embarrassed by a whole bunch of states saying we're going to defy you. And so I think if it is overturned, it'll be largely because of the growth of the abolitionist movement. And so that's I think a very important point here. But I still don't think it's the most likely case. I think the most likely case is Roberts leading the way and leading the more moderate justices to this compromise option. And the reason that that's the worst case scenario is obviously them abolishing abortion would be a good thing. Obviously them overturning Roe would be a less good thing, but it takes away one of the two major obstacles that we face in abolishing abortion. The two obstacles we face being this nullifying Roe obstacle and then the equal protection obstacle. Legislators who don't want to treat preborn children as equal under law and treat abortion as murder. And overturning Roe and putting it back to the states would get rid of one of those two obstacles. And so that would still be a good thing. If Roe is upheld entirely, Roe and Casey are not touched, and the 50-week ban is struck down, you'll see a lot of eyes opening and kind of the scales falling from people's eyes. And once again, seeing we can't hope in the Supreme Court. We've got to do it at the state level. And so if that happens, you'll see a lot of people become more aggressively anti-abortion and hopefully coming to the abolitionist movement. And so I think if that happens, the abolitionist movement will grow a lot. It'll grow by leaps and bounds by people who are just understand what we've been saying. The court is not the answer. The court is not what we need to be putting our hope in. And so that there'll be some good outcome there. If the 15-week ban is upheld, but Roe and Casey are maintained, this is the worst case because the pro-life establishment and the pro-life movement and all these people get to celebrate it as this great thing. We got a great incremental victory. They moved it from 20 to 15 weeks. So let's just keep chugging along, keep the incremental strategy when nothing's changed. The difference between 20 and 15 weeks, as Roberts pointed out, is virtually nothing.
Mm-hmm. And last time we had organizations, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, there were organizations, pro-life organizations, that were celebrating the decision. And we suspect that may be the case this time as well. These kinds of gradual rollbacks in a genocide that doesn't really affect it overall, they're not good. You need to end it now. There's no time for patience. You don't have the luxury of slowly walking anything back. You have the responsibility to your preborn neighbor to abolish it immediately without exception or compromise. And you have the responsibility with your words and your actions and your arguments to argue that way. You don't have the right to argue otherwise. So we are going to probably see a lot of celebrating if that compromise option is taken. And we hope that through our advocacy, through our pleading with people to see that they're going to see that compromise was nothing good in the first place. It was not something we ever should have celebrated. It's not something we ever should have asked for. And if that happens, we just need to push even harder to show people this is not a good thing.
Right. Compromise takes the wind out of the sails of the movement to abolish abortion. This is what Wilberforce talked about in his book. He talked about the greatest obstacle that I face, the people who keep taking enthusiasm out of the abolitionist movement, are the people who channel all this anti-slavery energy toward this gradual strategy. And that absolutely kills the movement. It kills the enthusiasm. It kills the urgency. And so if the Supreme Court, if they're trying to do kind of like the most evil thing that they could do is this compromise option, because it would take the sails, it would take the urgency out. It would tell people that, hey, we're winning, we're getting closer, when really nothing is changing at all. And so we've got to help people understand that the need is for abolition, and there's got to be the urgency for that call specifically, and not tolerate anything less. And I'm glad you brought up KCV Planned Parenthood. I didn't think of that until you brought it up. But yeah, KCV Planned Parenthood, in a sense, it was even worse than Roe, but in a sense, it was a compromise because the court did allow a few of the regulations that were in question in that case to be upheld. And so the pro-life movement took that and they said, this is a great victory. Really, it was the worst defeat ever. They had an 8-1 Republican-appointed majority, and that 8-1 Republican majority voted to essentially uphold Roe. It was a crushing defeat. But you had Gary Bauer of Focus on the Family out doing a press conference before the Supreme Court, right after the decision was handed down, saying this is a great day, a great victory for women and unborn children. Right? Just absolutely atrocious and sickening. Because celebration of incremental victories is how you build organizations. And so if he's trying to build Focus on the Family, he's got to say, look at all this great work we're doing, look at this great victory, so please donate to us so that we can keep getting these completely useless incremental victories. And that's how you get abortion for 49 years.
That, and it is perfectly natural to rejoice and celebrate the demands that you asked for being fulfilled. Because that's what they asked for. They asked for a compromise, and it's perfectly natural for a person to celebrate when they get that compromise. They shouldn't have asked for it in the first place. They should have said it needs to be abolished immediately without exception or compromise.
Right.
Demand the thing you actually can rejoice in, the thing that you actually can celebrate, not the thing that's going to be a halfway step towards actually abolishing abortion. As Garrison said, gradualism in theory is perpetuity in practice, and that is what this is doing. It's perpetuating the Holocaust. It's not slowing it down. It's not shrinking the size of the Holocaust. It's over time dragging it out far more than it needed to be dragged out, because we didn't demand something righteous, and we didn't tell people to do what they ought to do before Christ, as ruler of this world, of them, as government officials who they get their authority from. Their authority is derived from God. And when we pretend that it's not, they're never going to behave as though it is. And that's what they're doing. They're pretending that they're not under God's authority when they are.
Yeah. And so, again, I think it's important to reiterate in closing, not just analyze what happened, but we need to talk about what we need to do. And that is, we need to beat, well, let's even say the best case scenario, that they're about to abolish abortion or overturn Roe completely or something. Even if we know that's the case, which I don't think it is, but let's say even if it was, just in theory, what we need to do is not wait for that. We need to beat them to the punch. We need to go to our legislators in Oklahoma, in Texas, Indiana, Idaho, all over the place, and say, no, abolish abortion now. That's what God demands of us. That's what the Constitution, no matter what, however the Supreme Court wants to twist the Constitution, what the Constitution actually protects is the right to life and the right to equal protection. So let's obey God, let's uphold the Constitution, and let's ignore Roe instead of obeying Roe by ignoring God and ignoring the Constitution. And so we need to be going to our magistrates demanding that, demanding abolition, beat them to the punch, abolish abortion in states as soon as possible. And that's actually what's important. Another important note. That's the best way to get them to overturn Roe, right? As I said, the growth of the abolitionist movement might get them to do it. Them seeing like a whole bunch of states ignoring Roe and abolishing abortion would force their hand. It would force them to give it back to the states or to abolish abortion. That's how you make change happen, is by taking a strong stand and saying, no, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. Asking for compromise and then celebrating stupid compromises that don't do anything is how you get a Supreme Court that never feels any pressure to relent, never feels any pressure to repent, never feels any pressure to go back on the genocidal opinion that they have offered. And so we have to go to our magistrates at the state level, at the federal level, everywhere, and say, ignore Roe, abolish abortion now, no matter what they're doing. And that's the important takeaway here. So yeah, any other closing thoughts, Sam?
I think that's it.
All right, so thank you guys for watching this. Please share this on Facebook, because we're going to have it up on YouTube shortly. You can share it there as well, and beat them to the punch. Go to your state legislators today. Email your rep in your state senator. Ask for a meeting. Call them to abolish abortion. And if you'd like any help in that process, go to freethestates.org. Fill out our contact form. Ask us a question, and we'd be glad to help you out with that.
And this isn't our only, we're talking about this here on a live stream because it's timely and we need to get this out here, but we're going to have articles on this. We're going to have probably a podcast on this as well. So make sure you're ready for the pro-life celebrations and be ready to bring that to people and say, hey, this is not a good thing if we get the outcome that we suspect we're going to get, which is the compromise. So be ready to engage people on this because this is a very dangerous thing that people are doing. It involves the death of millions of children, and that is the seriousness with which we need to take this, and we need to stop pretending that we're actually winning something when the pro-life movement is continually losing and then calling it victory. So yeah, just be prepared to talk to people, to engage people in a kind manner, but also in a very straightforward and hard on the point manner, because this is not something that we can compromise on, and that's something the pro-life movement, that's really their bread and butter on this. So
So yeah, as Sam said, we're going to have more thoughts on this, so be sure to be checking the Free the States blog. Just go to freethestates.org and just scroll about halfway down the page and you'll see our blog. There will be an article up there later this afternoon. And subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe to the Liberator podcast on whatever podcast apps that you use. And also subscribe to Free the States on YouTube, where we also publish the podcast. And also go like us on Facebook. If you're watching on YouTube, go like our Facebook page so you're getting everything that we post there. So those are our rapid reaction thoughts. More thoughts coming soon, and we hope you guys will stick around for those.